Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be doing another meta report and wrap up, and this time I'm going to be taking a look at what the EX07 environment and meta actually looked like in the bigger picture. So when it comes to taking a look at any format, as of right now until we hit unification, we do have Japanese data that we could infer and go off of to try to gather some initial impressions on how our format is going to be played out. Obviously, the formats are going to be a little bit different this time around because of any bans and restriction lists on top of any promo changes that may or may not impact the overall format, but the fact that there is this space and time separation between when they're playing it and when we're playing it means that we're going to have a different experience overall when it comes to how our format plays out. So you do have to keep that in mind, and when it comes to actually collecting Japanese data, the vast majority of it is just going to be through Twitter, and I personally use Digimon TCG guides to be able to look and have some good, solid representation on a way that it's organized so that way I could actually infer and understand it. So when it comes to looking at this format, we could kind of see from what Japan was doing that for the most part, it was just a continuation of the BT17 environment, which was for the most part a continuation of the BT16 and EX6 environments, as there wasn't really that many new decks emerging and forming in the game. Yes, there is some noticeable change and noticeable power creep that's influencing how the meta is going to be shaping up, but for the most part, what we've been playing with is kind of just what we've still been playing with and is still good to this day. So what does the meta actually look like for the English side of things? And it's pretty much exactly as I said, it's just a continuation of the BT17 environment, and this couldn't be more true as almost none of the new decks in the EX7 set were anywhere near meta relevant, which is unfortunate but not completely unexpected. There were a couple of standout cards that did influence how the meta ended up shaping up, but when it comes to the meta itself, it kind of just centralized around 8 to 10 decks. So while that does seem pretty diverse, it did come at the risk and cost of basically killing the viability of rogue decks. So as of right now, with the EX7 data that we have about 23 different decks that were able to make it into the top 16s, which is less than what we had in EX. So that's just telling us that the diversity is also decreasing, not increasing. While this might seem like a lot of really good diversity just on the onset of that, the reality is the meta is slowly condensing itself as the power gap only increases between the tiers. So let's actually start taking a look at the EX7 data that we have and kind of just gather some more information based on what we have available to us. So here is just a quick timeline on what each event was, how many of each deck placed, and what deck placed into top 16s for each of the following events. This is a really decent spread when it comes to the different decks that were played, but we can start to notice some trends and patterns in terms of what's actually going to be good and what's more meta-defining than some of the others. So we could take that data and reorganize it to get a different perspective on how things are actually shaping up. So the best deck of the format this time around is Imperial Digimon and BT16 Magnamon X, gatekeeping a lot of decks from being playable due to its protection, offensive, and defensive capabilities, while needing very specific answers to be able to answer it, which most decks don't have, and of course the decks that are topping more consistently all generally have answers to this question. So that's kind of why, even though Imperial is the best deck, Magnamon X is still a deck to take into consideration when you're trying to prep and prepare for the meta, because it is still one of the more prominent and powerful decks in the game. So with all of these different decks, one thing that we do want to take a look at is how many decks actually did get lucky, and 7 of the 23 decks that we have here did end up making it into the top 16, which is nice and all. It's cool that luck still kind of can have a factor in propping up some rogue decks to make it so that the meta can look a little bit more diverse, but at the end of the day, they only had a 1 of showing, which isn't necessarily going to give a lot of players confidence that it has what it takes to be able to make it into top 16s consistently versus the 7 other best decks that we currently have in the meta, as shown by the graph here. So when it comes to what the best decks are, we have Imperial Digimon, Mirage Gaugamon, Ancient Garurumon, Leviamon, Fenry Lugamon, 7 Great Demon Lords, and Magnamon X as the core 7 decks that made the foundation of what EX07's metagame and environment generally looked like at the higher stages of competitive play. When it comes to variance, because certain decks do actually have variations, we could take a look at some of the decks that actually had those variants and break it down into what variant tends to be stronger. So when it came to Dex Dorugoromon, there was the black engine and the purple engine that it was playing with, and purple showed a little bit better results over the black side of things. Purple usually was the more consistent and faster color, and it just lacked a little bit of protection and control that the black side offered, but both were still relatively viable, being in the lower echelons of where it ended up in the current meta landscape. Then when it came to Ancient Garurumon, we had a red base and a blue base. This basically just meant you were playing either red rookies or blue rookies, and when it came to which one performed better, red performed better over blue just because red had more consistency and more aggression than blue did. Then when it came to Mirage, with its 2 variations on a Galaxy version, utilizing the Sun and Moon low end of Lightfang and Nightclaw, or just playing Mirage in a more traditional sense, Mirage Traditional tended to be what players found with more success. But as far as taking a look at the top decks more specifically, I just grabbed some random examples off of the top 16s, so we actually can have a frame of reference when it comes to what these decks look like at this current time frame. So when it comes to Imperial Digimon, it is a kind of high-rolly deck where you do need to see a lot of moving parts and pieces. It does have a lot of searching power to find all of its parts and pieces, and when it goes off, it is one of the strongest and fastest decks, having basically an answer to almost everything in the entire game, which is what made it so appealing to play to begin with. Then, when it comes to Mirage, this is basically still the same deck that we've been playing since BT13, and it's still good now because it is just one of the faster and more consistent OTK decks, getting more tools and tech that it could use to further enhance what it's capable of, depending on where you think the meta is currently going. And then when it comes to Ancient Garurumon, for the most part, this is just an aggro deck that's trying to be focused on getting up into Ancient Garurumon without really giving them a whole lot of ability to respond or react to what this card is capable of. And then when it comes to Leviamon X, this is, again, another deck that we've been playing with for a while with very little change or deviation because there really hasn't been the need for any because of how broken this Cerberus package actually is, utilizing X antibody and a lot of draw and discard-based mechanics to move insanely quickly while being hyper-consistent, and utilizing the Leviamons to control the opponent's field while also being big beat sticks that can close out the game relatively quickly, all on their own. Next, when it comes to Fenry Lugamon, he's still going to be the Takamikazuchi version, just focused around OTKing the opponent, utilizing whatever tools we have to make the deck as consistent as possible. Next, we have Magnamon X, which is probably the gatekeeper of the format. Sure, we do have Mother Shoto as of EX07 as a really good contender for a gatekeeper deck, but I think compared to the results that Magnamon X Antibody has gotten, it's very clear that this is the more oppressive deck because it actually has the ability to not only be as defensive as Mother Shoto, but it also has less answers than Mother Shoto, and it also has more ability to close out the game than Mother Shoto, doing some very similar things, creating a big uninteractable wall while being able to put lots of pressure onto the opponent at the same time. And then the last of the top decks is going to be 7 Great Demon Lords. So 7 Great Demon Lords, again, hasn't really changed. It's just where it currently stands in the meta is just the best clock-based deck, which is putting the opponent on a timer, and we did get Shoto to help propel the defensive capabilities to extend the clock in our favor even more. So now that we know what the top decks are, we could kind of start to infer why these decks are so good and even look at what actually won these events to kind of tell a different side of the story in terms of how the meta is playing out. So obviously people are going to want to play the best decks, and decks that generally take first place get a lot of extra attention, and we could see based on what actually took first place, Mirage compared to all of the other decks in EX07 had the most first places. The deck that came in second for holding the record of most first places this format was Leviamon X, followed by Fenrir Lugamon, 7 Great Demon Lords, and Imperial Jamon. And then as far as some additional data, because it's always fun to take a look at more data and kind of infer different things based on the data sets that we have, out of the top 8 decks, 50% of them are blue and 50% of them are purple. This is kind of creating a power discrepancy between what blue and purple are doing compared to the rest of the entire game. From the past 12 events that we had in the EX7 environment, 9% of the current metagame was rogue decks. That's not necessarily a huge percentage, especially since the percentage actually was larger in other formats. So if we want to put that into perspective, BT17, 18% of the meta was rogue decks. In EX6, 14% of the meta was rogue decks. In BT16, 25% of the decks were rogue decks. In BT15, it was 24%, and in BT14, it was about 28%. So we could use this kind of a data to see that there has been a trend in the overall decline when it comes to rogue representation ever since BT16 came out, which was when Magnamon X Antibody came out, which shouldn't really be a surprise, acting as, again, the best gatekeeper deck in the entire game. So even though the EX7 environment is over, we could still use this data to kind of see what is going to continue to be good going into the next format, which is going to be the Special Booster 2.0 format or the Nationals format. So this is going to be really important in terms of figuring out what the top decks are going to be, and we could still look at Japanese data. It's just Japanese data as of right now is becoming less and less useful, not only as we go more towards unification, but because how we're going to be getting the cards and when cards are played and what cards are even legal at any given moment are going to be a little bit different. So we could see that in Japanese BT18 environment, they had a ban and restriction happen, so some decks that were pretty good in their BT18 environment isn't going to be as good in ours, especially since Japan also had BT19 in its entirety and we only get half of BT19. But as we could see based on the Japanese data, the majority of it doesn't matter because we're still playing with the same exact decks that we've been playing with for the past couple of sets. And we could even take a look at the couple of events worth of data from Special Booster 2.0 that we actually do have to kind of see and tell the exact same story that's happening in Japan in the fact that the format is not changing. So, in conclusion, the game has not been getting better, it's actually been getting worse in my perspective. Most of the new decks that we've been seeing aren't good enough to be competitively viable and worth playing with, and we've been only playing with the same handful of decks for basically 3/4 of a year now, due to the overall power creep and power gap between what we have gotten and what we're getting, and literally just everything else on how they're being designed and the mechanics that we're playing with. So decks are becoming more problematic as card effects are trying to cheat on the memory and resource system of the game, further highlighting the overall shifts in the game, thanks to the existence of these types of cards only speeding up certain decks over others, putting them in a greater advantage. And that's how we currently got to our current state, on top of things having more protection and trying to make things as uninteractive as possible, which is the nature of what top decks are trying to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good or fun environment. So while the format does look wide, we realistically only have about 4-ish actual hardcore playable decks that are performing better than the vast majority of the rest of the game, which isn't necessarily a problem. What is a problem is the fact that rogue decks basically are dying out, and the majority of the game is being invalidated because of how big the power gap is to make the game as fast and uninteractive as they possibly can. And we do usually get a ban and restriction list post-Nationals, so that does give us a sliver of hope or something to look forward to, hoping that they're actually going to be fixing the game, but most likely nothing is actually going to be done to save the 2.0 environment, and we'd be lucky if they're even going to save the 2.5 environments as well, because who knows if they're going to just hold off on banning and restricting anything until post-Worlds or not, which I think would be a huge mistake, but all this kind of shows is the game is in very big desperate need for some form of shakeup as the meta has grown stale and frustrating. But this is all just my thoughts and opinions based on the data that I've been gathering, collecting, and observing. So feel free to tell me your thoughts to all of this down in the comments below, and while you're down there, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you found this video to be helpful and informative, and if you like this type of content as well. And with that, I hope to see you all in the next video.